Good day, all. This talk will explain how feminism works by looking at the history of feminism. It will examine the main feminist authors and present their basic ideas. Now, feminism was the last of sociology's four theoretical approaches to emerge. That is to say, the basic ideas of feminism are just as old as the other three. They all have their roots in 18th century European philosophy. However, while the other three theories came together in the 19th century, feminists for a long time remained isolated voices, largely ignored by the male establishment. It was only in the mid-20th century, after the Second World War, that feminism became a school of thought with many theorists. The reason for this is that it was only after the Second World War, as part of the West's major expansion of post-secondary education, that women were allowed to gain a higher education in large numbers for the first time in history. There had always been the occasional rich women who got themselves a private education, but this was the first time that large numbers of women could go to colleges and universities. The result was that the 1950s and 60s saw the creation of a women's intelligentsia, consisting of a large group of women with higher education. It was this women's intelligentsia that wrote feminist theory and that made feminism into a major theoretical approach. Feminism, of course, expresses women's view of society. Feminism begins with the assertion that men have ignored women's views for far too long, and that includes male sociologists. Feminism focuses on those issues which male sociologists have ignored, namely gender issues. Feminists examine issues like gender relations, gender roles, and gender inequality. And having examined these, feminists assert that society has become patriarchal or male-dominated. Feminists also pledge to fight against patriarchy. Because feminism, like Marxism, is not just an academic theory, it is also the ideology of a social movement, the women's movement. Feminists try to raise the consciousness of women and men regarding the injustices which have been and are being perpetrated against women, and they try to mobilize them to fight against those injustices. And through their work, feminists provide an example of the type of creativity that women can bring to society if only men will let them. The first well-known feminist author was Englishwoman Mary Wollstonecraft, who lived from 1759 to 1797. She was the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, but her own writings were more political. She built on the work of early male proponents of liberalism, like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Paine. They all argued against traditional aristocratic privileges and for universal civil rights and democracy. Their ideas helped to inspire both the French and the American revolutions, and they are enshrined in the American Constitution, which states that everyone has certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In particular, Thomas Paine published Rights of Man in 1791, and in response, Wollstonecraft in 1792 published her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In this book, she argued essentially that women should have the same rights as men, in particular the rights to vote, hold political office, own businesses, and get an education, all of which they were denied at the time. Although the book was well received by academics, it was not so well received by the male ruling class. For example, British Prime Minister Horace Walpole called her, quote, a hyena in petticoats, unquote. Given this vehement opposition from the male establishment, it is perhaps not surprising that feminism was slow to develop. In the 1830s, Englishwoman Harriet Martineau followed in Wollstonecraft's footsteps, lamenting that women still did not have the same rights as men. Like Wollstonecraft, she focused on women's lack of equal rights in the fields of politics, economics, and education. Martineau is now widely held to be the first woman sociologist. She translated Auguste Comte's work into English, as well as publishing a number of works of her own, and engaging in political activism in support of women's rights. As the 19th century wore on, male academics increasingly spoke out in favour of the women's cause. In 1837, the French socialist philosopher Charles Fourier coined the term Feminism, which entered the English language as Feminism in 1895. In the 1840s, Karl Marx declared himself to be a supporter of women's emancipation. Marx argued that gender inequality was connected to class inequality. He said that a male ruling class had arisen which dominated and exploited women as well as the male working class, just in a different way. He said that society needed to get rid of gender inequality as well as class inequality. But Marx did not believe that gender inequality could be eliminated without eliminating class inequality, and so he urged women to join with the male proletariat in staging a revolution and overthrowing capitalism. However, Marx's main focus was always on class, so he didn't write much about gender, and it turns out that women are even less interested than working class men in staging a violent revolution. In the 1860s, well-known Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin declared that the anarchist project of opposition to all structures of authority included all of those that created male domination, from the law to the family. Bakunin linked anarchism's critique of the domination of state and capital to a critique of male domination, and declared that men and women must have equal rights in society. Also in the 1860s, British philosopher John Stuart Mill contributed to the slowly growing feminist literature with a book entitled The Subjection of Women, published in 1869. Mill argued that gender inequality had been established in the past when might was right. Agricultural societies like feudal Europe were societies of constant warfare, and so they were run by the male military, and women were pushed down into second place. But now that Europe had entered the age of industrial society, gender inequality was an anachronism, an obsolete relic of the past. In the modern world, where the economy matters more than the military, restricting women to the role of housewives was wasting their economic potential. It would benefit not only women, but society as a whole, if women were given equal rights with men. As a Member of Parliament, Mill even submitted a formal proposal that Britain give women the vote, but the all-male Parliament did not pass it. In the 1880s, shortly after Marx's death, and based on some notes which Marx left behind, his friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels developed the first true Marxist theory of gender in a book entitled The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, published in 1884. It's not the world's catchiest title, but it does get right to the point, because Engels argued that gender inequality was caused by the rise of those three interconnected social institutions: the family, private property, and the state. Like Marx, Engels always based his theories on history. And, like Marx, Engels argued that early tribal societies, or what they called primitive communism, were societies of equality. There was no class inequality, and, said Engels, there was no gender inequality. There was a gender division of labour. Men did the hunting and warfare, women did the gathering and childcare. But since both men's and women's work was equally necessary for the survival of the tribe, men and women were equally respected. If a major decision had to be made, the whole tribe gathered round the campfire to discuss it, and men and women both had the right to speak. However, said Engels, that all changed with the rise of agricultural society. Agricultural society was much larger than tribal society, and so needed more formalized social structures. Politics was formalized by the state. The economy was formalized around private property, and the family was formalized by the marriage contract. The state and private property swiftly became dominated by men, primarily because men controlled the military and so took over the state and took the property by force. The introduction of formal marriage was essential to establish lines of inheritance for both private property and political office. For Engels, inheritance is the primary, although not the only, social institution that links gender inequality to class inequality. Engels believed that it had all been downhill for women ever since private property in the state were invented. In his day, 19th century Europe, women were still, by law, men's private property, and women had very few economic, political, or even civil rights. Among the capitalist class, the men owned the businesses, and among the working class, the men earned the wages. Either way, most women had no money of their own and had been made economically dependent on their husbands. The man controlled the family's livelihood, and so the man controlled the family. Women had been turned into baby factories and unpaid domestic servants for men. Engels believed that only a revolution to overthrow capitalism could change this situation. Alongside these male authors, women were also gradually finding their voice. In the early 19th century, as the first wave of feminism arose, it embraced an approach which has been called maternal feminism. In general terms, this movement sought to infuse more female and maternal values into society, such as caring, compassion, pacifism, and non-violence. And more specifically, it fought for women's maternal rights, gaining women the right of custody of their children in Britain for the first time in the 1830s. After this, the focus of the movement shifted to economic concerns, beginning with rising demands that women should receive equal pay with men, and continuing with gaining married women property rights, including the right to receive their own wages instead of having them given to their husbands by their male employers, a right which they gained in Britain and Canada in the 1870s. These victories in the struggle for family rights and economic rights spurred the first wave on to their biggest challenge, the fight for women's political rights. The culmination of the first wave was the struggle to gain women the right to vote and to stand for political office. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, feminists were often called suffragettes because they fought for women's suffrage, which means the right to vote. In North America, the women's movement took a major step forward with the organization of the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Just as Wollstonecraft's Rights of Woman was an explicit expansion of Paine's Rights of Man, so the convention adopted a Declaration of Sentiments, which was an explicit expansion of the American Declaration of Independence, to give women equal rights with men. In Canada, the so-called Famous Five got women recognized in law as persons or actual human beings rather than just the property of men, which was essential to them gaining civil and political rights. However, the movement granting women the vote actually swept across the English-speaking world beginning down under. The first country to grant women the vote was New Zealand in 1893, followed by Australia in 1902. Britain and Canada followed in 1918, and the US in 1919. The non-English world followed suit more slowly. Women only gained the right to vote in France in 1944 and in Switzerland in 1971. In the late 19th century, women also built on the work of Mikhail Bakunin and took up the creation of anarchist feminism. The most famous of these was Russian-born Jewish-American Emma Goldman. Her lectures attracted crowds in the thousands. However, she also spent much of her life in and out of prison and was once described as, quote, the most dangerous woman in America. She was originally arrested for attempting to assassinate a leading American industrialist as an act of what anarchists called propaganda of the deed. Anarchists believed that violence was justified to bring awareness of their cause to the general public, an attitude still taken by modern terrorists. The assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, which triggered World War I, was a similar anarchist propaganda of the deed. However, as her fame grew, Goldman realized that she could accomplish more with words than deeds. Her subsequent arrests were all for speaking out against the authorities, for inducing persons not to register for the wartime draft, for inciting to riot, and for distributing illegal information about birth control. A nurse by training, Goldman insisted that women should be educated about and have legal access to contraception. She also criticized marriage and the family as institutions of male domination, and instead promoted free love and an end to prejudice against homosexuals and lesbians. In the US, the use of contraceptives, primarily condoms and diaphragms, increased steadily through the 19th century until a new federal law made them illegal in 1873. This did not stop their use, but it did drive it underground, and it triggered a response from feminists. Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger in the US and Marie Stopes in England became the leading advocates for contraception in the English-speaking world. Sanger coined the term birth control, linking it to a woman's right to control over her own body and her reproduction. The world's first birth control clinic opened in Holland in 1882, but it was only in the early 1920s that other countries, including the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union, followed suit. In the US, the birth rate declined by 20% in the course of the 1920s, primarily due to increased use of birth control. Since then, of course, a variety of new contraceptive technologies have been developed, most importantly the birth control pill, which was introduced in 1960 and which underpinned the free love and sexual liberation of the 60s. The struggle for women's right to abortion has been much more difficult than their struggle for birth control. Although the Soviet Union legalized abortion in 1920, the US did not do so until the Roe v. Wade legal decision in 1973. This decision was the culmination of sustained pressure from the women's movement and was one of the landmark accomplishments of the second wave of the women's movement. While many thought that Roe v. Wade had become a permanent part of American law, it was overturned by the Supreme Court in June 2022. Women's abortion rights in the US are currently up in the air. Still, the attainment of women's political rights and contraceptive rights by the 20s marked a successful conclusion to the first wave in the English-speaking world. The goals that generations of women had fought for had been accomplished. After that, the movement had to regroup and develop new goals and new ideas. At the same time, the world went through the Great Depression, World War II, and the building of the welfare state. Part of that welfare state was a greatly expanded system of education and higher education, to which women gained admittance for the first time. The post-war generation was the first generation of women ever to have the opportunity to gain a higher education. The result, as I said before, was the creation of a women's intelligentsia, a large group of highly educated women who were ready to bring women's voice to the attention of not just academia, but the whole world. The first feminist voice to emerge in the post-war world was that of the French woman Simone de Beauvoir. She was the lover of famous French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and she combined his existentialist philosophy with Engels' Marxism in a book entitled The Second Sex, published in 1949. She began by agreeing with Engels on the importance of the economy, but she argued that gender inequality emerged even earlier than class inequality, and so was even more basic. She argued that, in addition to economic factors, gender inequality was based on two other factors that Engels missed. Firstly, culture. Society's culture promotes sexist ideas and values that favor male domination and that make people think of women as inferior to men. And secondly, biology. She argued that men's greater size and strength automatically made them more important to the survival of early tribal societies, and so made them the tribe's leaders. She concluded that society had been patriarchal since tribal times, and that this had distorted women's existence. As an existentialist, de Beauvoir argued that, while animals operate on instinct, human beings must consciously create themselves and their existence. We have the freedom to take responsibility for our lives. The problem for women is that they have been denied the freedom to become themselves by male oppression. Men have defined themselves as the central agents of society and have defined women as the other, a secondary, subservient position. This is why de Beauvoir famously said, quote, "One is not born a woman, one becomes one." In other words, the submissive role and secondary social status of women is not biologically determined. It is socially created and imposed on women. De Beauvoir called on women to reject their status in masculine culture and to redefine themselves by their own standards. De Beauvoir pioneered the post-war revival of feminism, but the second wave of feminism is generally considered to have begun with American Betty Friedan's publication of The Feminine Mystique in 1963. Friedan built on Wollstonecraft's liberalism and so founded a branch of feminism termed liberal feminism. These days it is also sometimes termed mainstream feminism, since it is the most widely accepted feminist viewpoint. Friedan argued that in modern Western society, women had been assigned the roles of housewife and mother, and had been told that those were the only roles that they should want to play. Femininity had been redefined to identify it with motherhood, and a mystique had been built up around motherhood. Motherhood was glorified, and women were told that they all had an innate need to be mothers. Jessie Bernard called this a process of coercive socialization, or in common parlance, brainwashing. Friedan and Bernard were among the first to speak out and say that while motherhood certainly has its rewards, just being a wife and mother was unsatisfying to many women. Women should not be put in this social straitjacket. They should have the opportunity to play all the social roles that men play. Following Friedan's pioneering work, the late 60s and early 70s saw an unprecedented explosion of feminist writing. The year 1970 alone saw the publication of 3 works, all now considered to be classics of feminism: Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch, and Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. Following that, 1971 saw the publication of Juliet Mitchell's Woman's Estate and the first edition of Ms. magazine, co-founded by Gloria Steinem. And 1972 saw the publication of Jessie Bernard's The Future of Marriage, followed by its 1975 sequel, The Future of Motherhood. Between them, these texts established the theoretical foundations of second-wave feminism. They analyzed the ways in which women were being oppressed by male, patriarchal society, and called on women to mobilize collectively and revolutionize gender relations and women's role in society. As feminist writing proliferated, different approaches inevitably emerged. The second wave saw the emergence of a number of schools of feminism. However, most remained small in adherence. The only ones that gained a widespread following were sometimes termed the Big Three. In order of popularity, they were liberal feminism, Marxist or socialist feminism, and radical feminism. Liberal feminism built on the work of Mary Wollstonecraft and Betty Friedan. Marxist feminism built on the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And radical feminism built on the work of Simone de Beauvoir and Shulamith Firestone. Liberal feminists argue that gender inequality is based on sexist attitudes and beliefs. But nobody is born sexist. We learn sexism the same way we learn most of our basic values and beliefs, through socialization or how we were raised. And socialization has changed over time. In early tribal societies, socialization was performed by groups of women who taught all children to respect women. And so tribal cultures the world over have emphasized respect for women. But in modern industrial society, mom's voice has been increasingly drowned out by male-dominated organizations insisting that society should be male-dominated. Organizations like the army, the state, schools, churches, media, and so on. In the 60s, liberal feminists drew attention in particular to sexism in Western culture and in the media, and began to demand that changes be made to the way Western culture portrays women. In the media, women were all either housewives or sex symbols. Feminists demanded that women be portrayed in responsible jobs as doctors, lawyers, and so on. This has happened, and it has helped to raise women's social status. In schools, texts, which at first showed boys playing sports and having adventures, while girls all sat around and played with dolls, have gradually given way to texts showing girls doing everything that boys do. The coercive socialization that Bernard wrote about has definitely lessened since she wrote about it, and so has gender inequality, although neither one has completely disappeared. But this is in no small part due to the efforts of liberal feminists. In the early 20th century, feminists also began to build on Marxism. It seemed to many women that there was a natural affinity between Marxism's critique of modern capitalist society and that of feminism. Both were not just academic theories, but also social movements fighting for the rights of the majority against an oppressive minority, the male ruling class. In the East, the Pole Rosa Luxemburg and the Russian Alexandra Kollontai became involved in the 1917 Russian Revolution and the subsequent building of the Soviet state. In the West, Marxist feminism didn't really get going until the 60s. For Marxist feminists, the root cause of women's oppression in capitalism was their exclusion from the world of business and the paid workforce. Without financial resources of their own, women were doomed to a secondary role in a society that valued money above all. Marxist feminists argued that even though it produced no marketable products, women's work in the home was reproductive labor, which was essential to the economy and indeed to the survival of society, and so it should be rewarded. The 70s saw the rise of the International Wages for Housework campaign. Even though this was ultimately unsuccessful, it made society more aware of the value of women's work and paved the way for social programs like family allowance. Moreover, in the post-war years, as increasing numbers of women entered the paid workforce, equal pay came to the forefront of women's agenda. Their concerted pressure on politicians paid dividends. The US passed the Equal Pay Act in 1963, and the rest of the West followed suit in the course of the 60s and 70s. While this did not provide women with equal pay overnight, it did set women's wages on an upward trajectory relative to men's wages. The 80s saw a separation arise between Marxist feminism and socialist feminism. The key issue was termed the mode of production debate. The question was whether gender inequality was an intrinsic, built-in feature of the capitalist mode of production, as Marx and Engels argued, or whether gender inequality was separate from class inequality and had just been seized on by the capitalist class in an opportunistic fashion to increase their profits. This issue had profound consequences for feminist strategy. Traditional Marxist feminists adhered to Marx and Engels' view that gender inequality could only be eliminated by overthrowing capitalism. Socialist feminists, however, argued that no such revolutionary upheaval was necessary. Gender inequality could be eliminated by gradual reform within capitalism. Far from being an essential prerequisite, the elimination of class inequality was just a distraction from the goal of gender equality. This change in the views of Marxist and socialist feminists was part of the broader change among Marxists who, in the late 20th century, mostly decided that revolutions like the Russian Revolution had failed and that the new goal was reform. The 60s and 70s also saw the birth of radical feminism, based in part on the work of Simone de Beauvoir. Radical feminism did not advocate political revolution, but it did advocate social revolution. It condemned all existing social institutions as patriarchal and sought to radically transform them all. One of the early goals of radical feminism was that of consciousness raising among women. Just as Marxism argued that the working class had been brainwashed into a state of false consciousness where they accepted the rule of the capitalist class, so feminists argued that women had been brainwashed into accepting their subordinate social status. The first step in overcoming women's oppression had to be making women aware of it. This was done by feminism in general, but more specifically by women's discussion groups, of which many were organized at this time. Two of the most influential were the New York Radical Women and the New York Radical Feminists. While their background was generally in Marxism, they moved beyond this to focus on patriarchy and founded the school of radical feminism. Indeed, these radical feminists coined the term women's liberation movement. They argued that gender inequality was even older and more basic than class inequality, and that the oppression of women was ultimately caused by male violence. They argued that this violence need not necessarily be physical. For example, economic discrimination does violence to women, as does the insistence that they adhere to male beauty standards. However, physical violence was at the heart of their analysis. Pre-industrial societies had various forms of institutionalized violence against women, such as widow burning in India, witch burning in Europe, genital mutilation in Africa, foot binding in China, and female infanticide worldwide. Modern industrial society has abolished such customs, not because it cares about women, but because it destroys all pre-industrial customs, good and bad. It has replaced them with various forms of individualized violence against women, such as sexual abuse and rape, sexual harassment in the workplace, enforced prostitution, persecution of lesbians, and above all, domestic abuse, physical, sexual, and psychological abuse in the home. While not all women are subjected to male violence, all are made aware of it, and so all are potentially intimidated by it. Radical feminists forced the issue of domestic violence against women onto the public agenda. Up to the 1950s, Western society virtually ignored domestic violence. It just wasn't considered worth worrying about. For example, in 1954, Commander G.H. Hetherill, then head of Scotland Yard, or in other words, Britain's top police officer, said, quote, "There are only about 20 murders a year in London, and not all are serious. Some are just husbands killing their wives." This callous attitude was not just the opinion of one man. It reflected official government policy. It wasn't until the 60s and 70s that feminists began to force Western governments to take domestic violence towards women seriously and to toughen up laws against it. In Canada, police originally wouldn't even intervene in domestic disputes because it was almost impossible to obtain a conviction for domestic assault until the law was toughened up as recently as 1983. Since then, calls from battered wives have become the single largest category of calls for help that the police receive and respond to. In addition, governments have established social programs and shelters to help battered wives. In short, radical feminists have forced Western society to admit that domestic violence towards women is a major social problem that affects millions of women, and to begin to fight against it. Alongside the big three theories, the second wave also included several other less well-known types of feminism. Emma Goldman's work was rediscovered in the late 60s and 70s as anarchist feminism enjoyed a revival and was renamed anarcha-feminism. Anarcha-feminists argue that all the authoritarian traits which anarchists are opposed to, including domination, exploitation, and aggression, are masculine. Meanwhile, those traits which anarchists support, like cooperation, caring, and compassion, are feminine. The creation, therefore, of a non-authoritarian, anarchist society based on cooperation and mutual aid in practice means the feminization of society. The idea that society would be improved by an injection of female values goes back to the maternal feminism of the first wave, but was taken to greater lengths by anarcha-feminism. The 70s also saw feminists practice anarchist tactics of organization, eschewing the hierarchical Marxist model in favor of allowing independent grassroots groups to emerge spontaneously. The late 70s and 80s also saw the rise of psychoanalytic feminism. Theorists like Nancy Chodorow built on the work of Sigmund Freud and his followers. Like Freud, they argued that human behavior is often based more on subconscious impulses than on conscious decisions. Specifically, when men create a patriarchal society, they do so not because they've made a deliberate commitment to male domination, but because they have needs and emotions which they're not even aware of, but which push them to take such actions. These needs emerge from what Freud termed the psychosexual development of the child. Freud believed that every child's first sexual attraction was to their parent of the opposite sex. He termed these attractions the Oedipus and Electra complexes. They introduce an underlying emotional ambivalence into the parent-child relationship. According to Freud, boys seek to emulate their fathers, but also to someday supplant them. Boys love their mothers, but they also resent the authority their mother has over them and rebel to establish their independence. Girls are submissive to their fathers, but are often emotionally distant from them. Girls seek to emulate their mothers, but often feel frustrated by the social role of housewife. This emotional ambivalence is then influenced by a culture which values men more positively than women. Boys admire the independence and sexual conquests of their fathers, while girls have mixed feelings about their mothers and so about themselves as women. Men feel an emotional need to control women, stemming from their relationship with their mother, and therefore invest a great deal of energy into maintaining patriarchy. Women generally recreate the submissive relationship they had with their fathers with other men in adulthood, and so lack the emotional motivation or energy to fight back against male domination. However, while this may have been a reasonable seeming argument in the early years of the women's liberation movement, I don't think that today one can argue that women have any less energy than men when it comes to fighting for their rights. Moreover, as a sociologist, I have a lot of difficulty with theories that explain social structures like gender inequality in terms of deep, dark, subconscious impulses focused on sex and death. The existence of any such impulses remains unproven. However, work in the tradition of psychoanalytic feminism has continued into the 21st century. The 70s also saw the birth of ecofeminism. The term was coined by the French feminist Françoise d'Aubonne. Ecofeminism explores the connection between women and nature. It expands on the anarcho-feminist opposition to all forms of social domination and argues that modern patriarchal capitalism dominates both women and nature and demands that instead both should be respected. Ecofeminism connects the women's movement to the environmental movement. The 90s saw ecofeminism splinter into several branches: cultural, Marxist, spiritual, and vegan. While most ecofeminists have taken a scientific approach, some have drawn on ancient spiritual beliefs which link women and nature, such as the Wiccan religion or the belief in Gaia, the goddess of nature, more popularly known as Mother Nature or Mother Earth. Ecofeminism has grown in importance as the environmental movement has grown in the 21st century. The third wave of feminism began in the early 90s. It was a clear continuation of the second wave. There was no break or pause between the second and third waves, as there was between the first and second waves. The gap between them should rather be seen as a generation gap. A new generation of feminists had grown up, and they introduced new methods, new concerns, and new theories into the women's movement. In particular, the 90s saw more new theories introduced into feminism than at any time since the early years of the second wave in the 60s and early 70s. The third wave is widely considered to have begun with the work of a group of young women in Olympia, Washington, US, who were inspired not by some stuffy old academics, but by a much younger and more recent voice of protest, punk rock. They called themselves Riot Girl, and they weren't just a band, they were the starting point of an underground feminist punk movement, which has spread to over 20 countries. Riot Girl songs normally emphasize female empowerment, while also drawing attention to social problems that women face, such as sexism, discrimination, rape, domestic abuse, and so on. The most famous group in this movement is the Russian band Pussy Riot. Formed in 2011, their protest songs quickly led to them being imprisoned in Russia, which provoked global protests in 2012 and led to their being designated prisoners of conscience by Amnesty International. The first feminist to call herself third wave was American Rebecca Walker in 1992. In an article in Ms. magazine, she expressed her outrage that Clarence Thomas had been appointed to the US Supreme Court by an all-male, all-white committee, thereby completely dismissing the testimony of law professor Anita Hill that he had sexually harassed her. Walker saw this as evidence that those who believed that feminism's struggle for women's equality had come to a successful conclusion were just fooling themselves. On the contrary, she said, quote, "The fight is far from over." Indeed, the issue of sexual harassment of women in the workplace has only grown as a focal point of the women's movement since the 90s, giving rise to the #MeToo movement, which I shall say more about shortly. More broadly, the third wave sought to expand the social basis of the women's movement. The first and second waves were run by the most educated and affluent women, white, professional, middle-class women. As a result, by the 90s, professional women had essentially attained equal pay and equal positions with their male counterparts. But if the slogan of the second wave was, "And what about the women?" then the slogan of the third wave was, "And what about the other women? What about poor women, women of color, handicapped women, and other minority women?" The third wave argued that they faced a double burden, one as women and one as a minority. As such, they lagged behind their white middle-class sisters. As their voices grew louder within the women's movement, the third wave took up the struggle for their rights. The first feminists to examine this double burden were African American. In 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw examined the intersection between gender, race, and class in modern society and introduced the concept of intersectionality into feminist theory. Her ideas were taken up in 1990 by Patricia Hill Collins in her landmark text, Black Feminist Thought, which argued that these and other social arrangements operate as what she termed vectors of oppression and privilege, which create a matrix of domination over women. The intersection of these vectors creates different forms of oppression and different life experiences for different groups of women. For example, black women generally experience greater oppression than white women. This approach led to the rise of intersectionality theory, developed by theorists like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks. Intersectionality theory is closely related to standpoint theory. Standpoint theory began with the work of Sandra Harding in the 80s, but was popularized by Dorothy Smith in the 90s. It is a feminist epistemology which argues that women's subordinate social position gives them a different standpoint and so different knowledge from men. Women see things in a way that men cannot, just as slaves and masters have very different viewpoints. No one standpoint is objective or complete. All standpoints are partial, and all should be respected. The standpoints of minority groups, such as women and persons of color, have been ignored by mainstream academia for too long, and so standpoint theory largely focuses on making their views known. The 90s also saw the emergence of queer theory. The gay community began to protest more loudly against the oppression which they were suffering from a straight society. Lesbians noted that their double burden often included male violence directed at them just for being what they were. More broadly, queer theorists objected to the social definition of heterosexuality as normal and of homosexuality, therefore, as abnormal or deviant. Homosexuals are a minority, but being a minority does not make them wrong or immoral. Queer theorists fight for gay rights, incorporating their struggle into the struggle for women's rights. Underlying all of these new theories was a turn towards postmodernism in feminist thought. Postmodernism rejects the belief that science can establish objective truth, and instead argues that everyone has their own truth. This relativist position provided a convenient epistemological basis for a women's movement seeking to incorporate a greater diversity of social groups and opinions. In particular, Michel Foucault's work on how knowledge and sexuality are shaped by relations of power was built on by theorists such as Judith Butler. Postmodernist feminists have even questioned the very meaning of the categories of man, woman, and gender, arguing that they should be redefined. Some writers have argued that a fourth wave of feminism emerged in the 2010s. However, this decade was not characterized by the emergence of new feminist theories or goals. The third wave's standpoint theory and its goal of inclusivity continue to predominate. What changed was the emergence of new forms of feminist activism. Specifically, feminists turned to internet activism. Social media and other internet media were used to spread their message. This approach has also been termed #feminism, particularly since the introduction of its most well-known initiative, the #MeToo movement against sexual harassment. Whether or not you think #feminism constitutes a fourth wave of feminism is up to you, but for now, I'm sticking with the model of 3 waves of feminism. 3 waves that we've now looked at. One thing I've tried to bring out in this talk is that the development of the women's movement and the development of feminist theory have been intertwined. As women have fought for their rights, issue after issue has come to the forefront. Political rights, economic rights, reproductive rights, and so on. Each issue, each struggle, has provided a focus for a fresh generation of feminist writers. Feminist theory has evolved as women's position in society has evolved. This is because feminism is not just a theory, it is the voice of the world's largest social movement. To conclude on feminist theory, I want to make the same argument that I made about sociological theory as a whole. The theories that we've looked at should not be seen as competing, but as complementary. Each of them focuses on a different aspect of gender relations and gender inequality. Each of them asks different questions and so gets different answers. I would argue that we need to put all of them together to get a complete picture. That concludes what I have to say on the history of feminism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day, all.